Why do we practice celibacy? For any monk, or indeed anyone who really wants to practice seriously the teaching of the Buddha, celibacy is essential. So why is this? First of all, we should understand what is celibacy. We don't mean just not having sex, just not engaging in sexual intercourse. It's deeper than that. It means to really give up all the world of sexuality and to take as a path, as a practice, singleness and celibacy, a life of singleness and celibacy, as opposed to having the life generally revolve around the subject of sexuality, which is essentially the normal path. So much energy is spent by people for the sake of this one subject that by truly renouncing completely this subject wholly and from the depth of the heart, one removes a really huge chain that is tying us to the material world and preventing us from having the energy to go for a higher aim. And having a higher aim, the higher aim for which we want to work, towards which we want to go, is also intimately tied up with the renunciation of sensuality or anything else. So if we don't have a clear sense of a higher purpose, a higher aim in life, then it's very unlikely that we will see any point in giving up sexuality. And that's one reason as well why, especially in the modern Western culture from which I'm speaking to you, anybody who chooses celibacy as a path for their entire life, it's very rare to hear about that. And people who do this tend to be viewed with a kind of suspicion, because in our culture, we don't really have a spiritually rich culture at all. Everything is very materialistic. The highest purpose or the most important value that we can have in our life is generally described as love. And sexuality is always equaled, or at least very deeply involved and interlinked with love, or the idea of love. And there is no sense of why anybody would want to give up something like that. And if people do, they're seen as basically just poor them, we pity them, they're suppressing themselves for their whole life. While in other cultures, like in particular India would be a good example, it's a very spiritually rich place, and it's extremely common. Many people choose celibacy, not necessarily even as monks in a particular sect, but they just choose to go for a higher spiritual path. And everybody, in almost all cases, this involves renouncing sexuality. So the first point in understanding celibacy is to understand the higher aim for which we renounce this. It's a bit like if somebody wants to be an astronaut, if he really wants to be an astronaut, if this is his aim, it takes so much dedication and work, so many hours of constant dedication, that he can't allow himself to keep on spending so much time playing video games, for example, or so much time watching TV series. He has to put all of his energy into working towards his higher aim. As somebody practicing the teaching of the Buddha, it's perhaps even clearer than this, because the higher aim for which we are practicing is, we should even say, the highest aim of going out of suffering, which means to remove all the cause of suffering from oneself. And the cause of suffering in the teaching of the Buddha is desire, craving, attachment. Therefore, if we are working towards this aim, naturally we have to let go and renounce desires, cravings and attachments. And a big desire, craving and attachment is sexual desire. So it's as straightforward as if my aim is, if I'm an alcoholic, for example, if I'm somebody who is suffering from an addiction, and my aim is to stop being a slave to this addiction, well, I have to give up taking the thing to which I'm addicted. If I want to stop smoking cigarettes, I have to stop smoking cigarettes. It's the same. But of course, giving up all sexual desire is a bit more complicated than just giving up a substance. So how do we go about doing that? Working to remove the desire of sexuality is done in two ways, or it has two parts, if you like. One part is just the purely physical desire, and the other part is more of the mental attachment to romantic love or having a partner or all of the mental aspect of sexual desire, which is a bit more complicated. I won't go into either of these in great detail for the moment, but there's also a third, slightly more subtle aspect, but that is quite important. And it's this that I want to just open up a little bit more finally. And this is that what blocks us from letting go of an attachment is often not so much the attachment to the thing itself, but the attachment to the particular view that we have with regard to that thing. So we're attached, for one thing, to sexuality, for example, but we're also attached to our way of seeing it. Without knowing, we've always been conditioned to see it in a certain way. And if we can detach ourselves from the views and ideas we tend to hold about, for example, the subject of sexuality, but it goes for many other things too, already this is a very big step on the way to being able to remove the attachment to the object itself, which is surprisingly often not so important. So, for instance, in the current modern Western society, the view of sexuality that our society teaches us is that it is good, for one thing, that it is necessary, that it is a fundamental part of human nature, and at the same time, it is seen as basically nothing more than a game. It has no moral value. It's quite different to the rest of human history and most of the world, actually, still today, where it's not just a sort of a game or something that you do just for fun or just for your own pleasure. It was always really deeply involved or deeply ingrained in the life of a family, a household. In general, I don't say this is the case everywhere and at all times, but in general, it was the man, for example, who would have to work all of his life and gain enough money in order to be able to maintain a household, in order to then be able to take a wife to his home. A bit like the male birds who have to make their nest perfect in order for the female bird to finally accept to come into the nest. So just to see that it's only very recently that it is seen so cheaply or taken so lightly that it's become basically more or less a form of entertainment or a game. That's it. So this is not wanting to sort of make a nostalgia, everything was better in the past. I'm telling that we have to give up all sexuality, whatever form it is or however we've seen it. But it's just to point out that we are always brought up believing, no matter where we are or where we live or at what time we live, we believe that how things are now and how things are seen now in our culture is the natural, normal and correct way for things to be. But how could that be the case? Always things change, viewpoints change, values change. Values are different already in many parts of the world. We're not obliged to stay in this same mindset just because we happen to be born in it. So this goes for sexuality, subject of sexuality, as much as it goes for everything else, all philosophies, all views and all ideas. We assume, for example, that sexuality is a necessary or fundamental part of human nature. But in many parts of the world, even today, that's not the case. It's not seen like this. It's quite normal to not even know much about sexuality for much of your adult years. So all this again is just to make the point that our way of seeing, our view of sexuality is not the only way of seeing. It's not the only view. Actually, we have a choice about how we live and how we think and how we act in everything. So we can choose to continue to be preoccupied with sexuality, with this one subject that all revolves around basically one organ of the body, which is such a sort of small, low form of pleasure compared to the great potential that we as human beings have, which, on top of everything else in our current society, is only really, it's nothing more than a form of entertainment. Everything we do comes down to just entertaining ourselves. Nothing more. So is that how we really want to live? Does it make us happy? Is it fulfilling for us? Is it enough for us, really? If we really look, we'll see that it's never actually enough. It doesn't fulfill us, even if we think it does. Why? Because we never have enough of it. Until the end of the life, always running for more. So what if there were something higher, a higher aim? We have the potential to find wisdom. We have the potential to purify ourselves. We have the potential to go so high by working on ourselves. We come back to the beginning, why we decide to renounce, out of having faith in the possibility of finding knowledge, finding truth, finding wisdom. Based on this, we renounce and decide to be celibate.